There are years in history that look ordinary from the outside and are catastrophic from the inside. Years where the machinery of power is rearranged so completely that nothing afterward resembles what came before, and yet the people living through it barely noticed. 1913 was one of those years. In 12 months, the United States government accomplished three things that its founders had specifically designed the Constitution to prevent. It handed control of the nation's money supply to a private banking cartel. It established a permanent claim on the income of every American worker. And it removed the one structural mechanism that had kept the federal government answerable to the individual states. Three transformations 1 year. And the country that emerged from December of 1913 was, in the most fundamental constitutional sense, a different republic than the one that had entered January. Most Americans learn about these changes separately, in different history classes, framed as unrelated reforms responding to different problems. The Federal Reserve is taught as a response to banking panics. The income tax is taught as a response to inequality. The 17th Amendment is taught as a democratizing reform that made the Senate more responsive to ordinary voters. All three framings are, at minimum, incomplete. And when you examine what actually happened in 1913, when you look at who was in the room, who funded the campaigns, who drafted the legislation, and who benefited from each change, a very different picture emerges. Not a conspiracy theory, something more unsettling than a conspiracy theory. A coordinated transformation of American governance carried out largely in the open by people who were quite clear about what they were doing, in front of a public that was largely too distracted to notice. This is the story of that year, and it begins as most stories about power in America begin, not in Washington, but on a private island off the coast of Georgia. Jekyll Island sits about 10 miles off the coast of Brunswick, Georgia. In 1910, it was owned by a private club whose members included some of the wealthiest men in America. Names like Morgan, Vanderbilt, Pulitzer, and Astor, the kind of men who did not vacation near other people. In November of that year, a group of men gathered there under conditions of extraordinary secrecy. They travelled separately. They used first names only. They told no one where they were going. When they arrived, they spent 9 days working on a document that would become, with modifications, the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. The men at Jekyll Island included Senator Nelson Aldrich of Rhode Island, who chaired the Senate Finance Committee and whose daughter had married John D. Rockefeller, Jr. There was Frank Vanderlip, the president of National City Bank, the largest bank in the country at the time. There was Henry Davison, a senior partner at J.P. Morgan and Company. There was Benjamin Strong, who would later become the first head of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. There was Paul Warburg, a partner at the investment bank Kuhn, Loeb and Company, who had emigrated from Germany where his family ran one of the most powerful private banks in Europe. And there was Piat Andrew, the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury. These were not disinterested reformers. They were the representatives of the banking interests that would directly benefit from the institution they were designing. Between them, the men at Jekyll Island represented an estimated quarter of the entire wealth of the world. They were designing the institution that would regulate the banking system of which they were the dominant players, and they were doing it in secret, on a private island, using assumed names. Frank Vanderlip later confirmed all of this publicly. Writing in the Saturday Evening Post in 1935, more than 2 decades after the event, he was remarkably candid. He wrote that if it were to be exposed that our particular group had got together and written a banking bill, that bill would have no chance whatever of passage by Congress. Therefore, we had to work in the most absolute secrecy. Read that again. The men writing the legislation knew that if Congress understood who had written it and why, it would not pass. So they hid. And it worked. The banking panics of the late 19th and early 20th centuries were real. Banks failed. Depositors lost savings. Credit contracted suddenly and painfully. The panic of 1907 was particularly severe, and it was J.P. Morgan himself who had largely resolved it, coordinating private bank bailouts in a series of late-night meetings that stabilized the system. Morgan's intervention was brilliant, effective, and deeply alarming to anyone who understood what it meant. The financial stability of the United States had been dependent on the willingness and capacity of one private individual to act. When Morgan died in 1913, The question of who would play that role next became urgent. The Federal Reserve was, in part, the answer to that question. But the answer it provided was not to remove private banking power from the equation. It was to institutionalize it. The Federal Reserve System, as established in 1913, was structured in a way that has confused Americans ever since. It is not a government agency. It is not a private bank. It is something deliberately designed to be both and neither. The 12 regional Federal Reserve banks are technically owned by the member banks in their districts. Member banks own shares in their regional Fed. Those shares pay a guaranteed dividend. The regional banks select 6 of the 9 directors on each regional bank's board. The Board of Governors in Washington is appointed by the President and confirmed by the Senate, giving the appearance of government control. But the critical operational decisions, particularly interest rate decisions, are made by the Federal Open Market Committee, which includes the presidents of the regional banks who are not government employees and who are selected through a process dominated by the member banks. The result is an institution that can deploy the full coercive power of the federal government, including the authority to create money. But that is insulated from democratic accountability in ways no other government institution approaches. When the Federal Reserve creates or destroys money, raises or lowers interest rates, how decides which banks to rescue and which to let fail. It does so without a vote of Congress, without presidential approval, and without any meaningful audit of its operations. The Fed's internal deliberations were kept secret for decades. It was not until 1994 that the Fed began releasing transcripts of its meetings, and even then with a 5-year delay. Paul Warburg, one of the Jekyll Island drafters, was appointed to the original Federal Reserve Board. His brother Max ran the German central bank. The Warburg family occupied positions of influence in the central banking systems of multiple countries simultaneously. This is not a conspiracy. It is simply how financial power worked in the early 20th century. The Federal Reserve Act was signed by President Woodrow Wilson on December 23, 1913. Mixed 2 days before Christmas, Congress had largely emptied out for the holiday. The vote on the Senate side came after a procedural maneuver that cut off debate. Many members who would have voted against it were already gone. But to fully understand why 1913 was the pivotal year it was, you cannot look at the Federal Reserve in isolation. You have to look at what else was happening simultaneously. And you have to understand that the income tax and the transformation of the Senate were not separate reforms. They were load-bearing elements of the same structure. The 16th Amendment, which authorized the federal income tax, was ratified on February 3, 1913. This requires some historical context that is almost never provided in standard tellings of the story. For most of American history, the federal government was funded primarily through tariffs, customs duties collected at ports of entry on imported goods. This system had profound political consequences. It meant that the federal government's revenue was directly tied to the volume of international trade. It meant that the primary taxpayers funding the federal government were not American workers, but foreign manufacturers, and the importing companies that handled their goods. It meant that the federal government had a built-in incentive to keep trade flowing, because trade was the lifeblood of its own finances. The tariff system also distributed political power in a particular way. Industrial interests in the Northeast generally favored high tariffs because they protected domestic manufacturers from foreign competition. Agricultural interests in the South and West generally opposed them because tariffs raised the cost of manufactured goods that farmers needed to buy. The tariff debate was one of the defining political conflicts of the 19th century, keeping the federal government's financial interests exposed to the political economy of ordinary commerce. The income tax changed all of this. A federal government funded by income taxes has a fundamentally different relationship with citizens than one funded by tariffs. The tariff-funded government needed healthy commerce. The income tax-funded government needed healthy incomes, which meant it needed a healthy economy. But it also meant something more structural. It meant that the government's revenue base was now the wages and profits of American citizens and businesses. The government's fiscal interests were now directly tied to the productivity of the American workforce in a way they had never been before. This sounds neutral, even benign, but consider what it meant for the Federal Reserve, which was created in the same year, a central bank that controls interest rates and money supply, now operates in a country where the government's revenue depends on economic activity measured in dollars. The Federal Reserve's decisions about money supply and interest rates directly affect the government's tax revenue. The government's spending decisions directly affect the economic conditions in which the Fed operates. The two institutions are now fiscally dependent on each other in ways that have no precedent in American history, and the income tax that was originally sold to the American public was nothing like what it became. When the 16th Amendment was ratified, advocates insisted that it would only apply to the very wealthy. The initial rates confirmed this. The first income tax under the new amendment imposed a 1% rate on income above $3,000 with a maximum surtax of 6% on incomes above $500,000. In 1913, $3,000 was roughly equivalent to what a skilled professional might earn in a year. Factory workers, farmers, shopkeepers, most of the working population paid nothing. Within 5 years, by the end of the First World War, the top marginal rate had reached 77%. Within a generation, the income tax had expanded to cover the vast majority of American workers. The assurances given during ratification that this would be a tax on the rich and nothing more had evaporated. The infrastructure was in place, and infrastructure, once in place, gets used. This is perhaps the most important lesson of 1913 as a whole. The changes of that year were not just policy changes, they were infrastructural changes. They created mechanisms, institutions, legal frameworks that would be used, expanded and repurposed by every subsequent government. The people who ratified the 16th Amendment had no power to bind future Congresses to the rates they chose. The people who designed the Federal Reserve had no power to prevent future boards of governors from policies they never envisioned. What they built outlasted their intentions by a century and is still running. Now we come to the third transformation, and it is the one that receives the least attention, which is remarkable given that it may have been the most constitutionally significant of the three. The 17th Amendment, ratified on April 8, 1913, changed how United States senators were chosen. Before it, senators were selected by state legislatures. After it, they were elected directly by popular vote. This change is almost universally described as a democratic reform, a progressive achievement that removed backroom dealing from Senate selection and gave the people a direct voice in choosing their federal representatives. That framing is not wrong. It is incomplete in a way that strips the change of its constitutional meaning. The original structure of the United States Senate was not a mistake or an oversight. It was a deliberate architectural choice rooted in the founding generation's theory of how to balance power between different levels of government. The House of Representatives was designed to be the voice of the people, elected directly, with short terms apportioned by population. The Senate was designed to be the voice of the states, selected by state governments, with long terms equal representation regardless of population size. The two chambers embodied two different principles of representation, and the requirement that both agree on legislation was the mechanism by which both principles had to be satisfied before the federal government could act. This was not abstract political theory. It had concrete practical consequences. Next, a senator selected by a state legislature was answerable to that legislature. His continued tenure depended on maintaining the confidence of the state government that selected him. This meant that a senator who voted to expand federal power at the expense of state power was voting against the interests of the people who would decide whether he kept his job. The structure created an automatic institutional resistance to federal overreach built into the Senate itself. When the 17th Amendment replaced state legislative selection with popular election, it removed this structural check. A senator elected by popular vote is answerable to voters, not to the state government. If he votes to transfer power from the state to the federal government, the state government has no recourse. Among the structural resistance to centralization that the original Senate design had built in was replaced with a system where senators had the same incentive as representatives to favor federal expansion, because federal power delivered to constituents wins elections. The timing of the 17th Amendment, in the same year as the Federal Reserve and the income tax, is worth sitting with carefully. A federal government with a new source of revenue, independent of tariffs, now also had a new borrowing mechanism through the banking system the Federal Reserve anchored, and a Senate that was no longer structurally resistant to the expansion of federal power. All three changes, taken together, removed three of the most significant constraints that the original constitutional design had placed on the federal government's ability to grow, borrow, tax and centralise. This is not a partisan observation. It does not favour one political party's agenda over another's. Both parties have used these mechanisms extensively. Both parties have benefited from the expanded federal power that 1913 made possible. The observation is structural. Before 1913, the federal government faced institutional constraints that made expansion difficult. After 1913, those constraints were substantially weaker. The subsequent century of federal growth followed logically from the changed institutional landscape. Who wanted these changes? This is where the history becomes genuinely complicated and genuinely interesting. The progressive movement of the early 20th century was not a monolith. It contained genuine reformers who believed that industrial capitalism had concentrated power in the hands of a small elite, and that government had to be strengthened to counteract that concentration. It contained populists angry about the power of railroads, banks and trusts. And it contained, in smaller numbers but with vastly disproportionate resources, members of the financial elite itself who understood that a stronger federal government was not a threat to their interests, but a tool for consolidating them. The insight that the most sophisticated members of the financial establishment had reached was this: a federal government powerful enough to regulate the economy was also one that could be captured. A decentralized system of state governments, smaller banks, and regional economic centers was harder to control because the points of influence were too dispersed. Centralization was good for those with enough resources to influence the center. This analysis was not hidden. It was discussed openly in the journals and correspondence of the period. The men who went to Jekyll Island were not worried about a powerful federal government. They were worried about a powerful federal government that they did not control. The Federal Reserve they designed addressed that worry elegantly by creating an institution with governmental authority that was structurally insulated from democratic accountability and dominated by the banking interests themselves. Woodrow Wilson, who signed all three of these changes into law, was not naive about what he was doing. In 1913, he said something that has been quoted by people on opposite sides of the political spectrum ever since. He said that the biggest men in commerce and manufacture were afraid of something, of a power somewhere so organized, so subtle, so watchful, so interlocked, so pervasive, that they had better not speak above their breath when they spoke in condemnation of it. Wilson said this while signing the legislation that consolidated that power. Whether he was describing something he accepted, something he regretted, or something he did not fully understand, is a question historians continue to debate. What is not debatable is what happened in the decades after 1913. The Federal Reserve presided over the greatest credit expansion in American history in the 1920s, followed by the greatest contraction, which became the Great Depression. Milton Friedman, the 20th century's most celebrated defender of capitalism, concluded after exhaustive research that the Federal Reserve was primarily responsible for turning a recession into a depression by contracting the money supply precisely when it should have expanded it. The institution created to prevent banking panics produced the worst economic catastrophe in American history within 2 decades of its founding. The income tax, meanwhile, grew from a narrow levy on the wealthy into the comprehensive withholding system that now reaches the majority of American workers before they ever see their paychecks. The withholding system itself was introduced during World War II as a temporary wartime measure and made permanent in 1943. The temporary always tends to become permanent when the infrastructure is already built, and the Senate, now directly elected, became over the course of the 20th century progressively less distinguishable from the House in its institutional behaviour, more responsive to the same electoral pressures, more dependent on the same fundraising sources, and progressively less effective as a check on the expansion of federal power. The states, whose interests the original Senate was designed to protect, have watched their relative power decline steadily across the century that followed the 17th Amendment. None of this was inevitable. It was chosen. The choices were made in a specific year, by specific people under specific circumstances that reward careful examination. Understanding those circumstances requires only the recognition that powerful people act in their interests, that institutions designed by the powerful tend to serve the powerful, and that the framing of any major policy change by those who benefit from it should be examined with some skepticism. The story of 1913 is ultimately a story about how change happens in democratic societies. It does not happen through violence, usually. It happens through the patient construction of the legal and institutional infrastructure within which all subsequent decisions will be made. The people who understood this in 1913 were extraordinarily effective at it. The people who did not understand it were, and many of their descendants still are, living with the consequences. Imagine it is December of 1913. The Federal Reserve Act has just been signed. The income tax amendment was ratified 10 months ago. The Senate has been popularly elected since April. In Washington, the people who drove these changes are quietly satisfied, not triumphant. Triumphant is conspicuous and invites opposition. Satisfied, the architecture is in place. The rest, they understand, is merely a matter of time and patience. In the newspapers, the conversation has already moved on. There is trouble in Europe. The Austro-Hungarian Empire is straining. Germany is rearming. The Ottoman Empire is collapsing. The world is on the edge of a war that will change everything. And when that war comes, the new institutions of 1913 will be put to work funding it, taxing for it, borrowing against it, like in ways that would entrench them so deeply into American life that questioning their existence would come to seem to most Americans like questioning the existence of the weather. That is the genius of structural change. You do not have to convince people to accept it forever. You only have to make it normal. And once something is normal, it is very nearly permanent. The year was 1913, 3 amendments, 1 new institution, and the constitutional architecture of a republic quietly and irrevocably rearranged. Whether what was built in that year serves you or serves others is a question worth asking. The fact that so few Americans think to ask it is perhaps the most interesting legacy of all. If this examination of 1913 gave you something to think about, subscribe and stay with us. We cover the history that shapes the present without the comfort of easy answers. See you in the next one.